Hey everybody, and welcome back to Quest for Truth. Now, if you didn't see last week's video, you're going to want to go back and look at that, or at least check out the passage that we looked at last week, because this week is really going to be a continuation from that. And when we look at the beginning of this passage, we'll see why. But we're going to start, we're going to be in Luke chapter 12, verses 35 through 48 today, and we're going to start with 35 through 40. And it says this: "Be dressed in readiness, and keep your lamps lit. Be like men who are waiting for their master when he returns from the wedding feast, so that they may immediately open the door to him when he comes and knocks. Blessed are those whose slaves whom the master will find on the alert when he comes. Truly I say to you that he will gird himself to serve, and have them recline at the table, and will come up and wait on them. Whether he comes in the second watch or even in the third, and finds them so, blessed are those slaves. But be sure of this, that if the head of the house had known at what hour the thief was coming, he would not have allowed his house to be broken into. You too be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour that you do not expect." And so the beginning of this, the first verse 35, "Be dressed in readiness and keep your lamps lit." So that's what we were really talking about last week, of being ready, having our, not a physical readiness, but a spiritual readiness of having your heart always inclined toward God. And so that's what we're talking about here, is that whole passage that we looked at last week, of keeping our focus and our minds and our hearts on God, and living in light of that. Now this week, this passage, we kind of get to the kind of why we should do that, in a sense. And so he says, live this way, be prepared always in this way, keeping your treasure in heaven. He says, be like men who are waiting for their master when he returns from the wedding feast, so that they may immediately open the door to him when he comes and knocks. So the idea of being there at the moment that he returns. Now this is, right, he's telling a parable here, and this parable is of this master who leaves, and he's expected at some point, but no one knows when he will return. But the idea of readiness, the idea of being prepared, is to be ready, so that when he returns, the door can be opened and he can be welcomed home immediately. Right, and then he says these slaves are blessed who the master finds on alert when he comes. Right, and then it continues to say that he will serve them and wait on them. And then, whether he comes in the second watch or even in the third. And if you have a different version or translation of the Bible, it'll say something different. But, the second watch and the third watch, the second watch refers to the hours between 9 p.m. and midnight, and the third between midnight and 3 a.m. So it's a very dark, late hours of the night. So it's, in the night when you're not usually prepared for something, to happen. So he's saying, be prepared almost when you kind of shouldn't be prepared, when you should be at sleep, always be prepared, or even in sleep to be prepared. And he continues and he says, but be sure of this, that if the head of the house had known at what hour the thief was coming, he would not have allowed the house to be broken into. You too be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour that you do not expect. So he brings in this idea of a thief coming, and this is almost kind of another parable, or kind of parable-centric idea here. Of he kind of moves on from the idea of the master who is, gone to this wedding feast, and when he returns, to this idea of a thief who comes usually at night, but you never know when the thief comes. And he says, if you did know, you would, protect against that thief. You would make sure that he can't get into the house, that he can't steal anything. So he says, if you knew what time the thief was coming, you would be prepared for the thief. Likewise, the Son of Man is coming at an hour you don't know. We don't know when he is coming, and yet we should always be in readiness, always being prepared. And again, that preparation is our hearts, is our of being, having our treasure in heaven. And so then we kind of have this, then this next passage, Peter brings up a question, and then we kind of see Jesus' response to that in verses 41 through 48. And it says, Peter said, Lord, are you addressing this parable to us or to everyone else as well? And the Lord said, who then is the faithful and sensible steward, whom his master will put in charge of his servants, to give them their rations at the proper time? Blessed is that slave whom his master finds so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you that he will put him in charge of his possessions. But if that slave says in his heart, my master will be a long time in coming, and begins to beat the slaves, both men and women, and to eat and drink and get drunk, the master of that slave will come on a day when he does not expect him, and in an hour he does not know, and will cut him in pieces and assign him a place with the unbelievers. And that slave who knew his master's will and did not get ready or act in accord with his will will receive many lashes. But the one who did not know it and committed deeds worthy of a flogging will receive but few. From everyone who has been given much, much will be required, and to whom they entrusted much, of him they will ask all the more. So Peter asked this question that really helps us to understand more of what Jesus was saying before. It kind of clarifies and kind of brings out the point of what Jesus was getting at in that first part about this, with the servants being prepared and the thief breaking in, right? The Son of Man is coming. But Peter says, Lord, are you addressing this parable to us or to everyone else as well? And I think that's a really great question, because when you look at what we've been looking at, if you go back, chapter 12, verse 22, and he said to his disciples, and that's the last time that we've seen an audience here. And so he had turned at this point from the crowds to his disciples primarily. And so he's speaking directly to his disciples. So there's other crowds, other people there. And so he's asking him, is this just for us, what you're saying, or is it for everyone else as well? Does it apply to all or just us? Now, the one thing that he says, when he says us, it's kind of difficult to know if he's referring to, the 12 disciples or the larger group of disciples exactly. But that's not really what's in, doesn't really matter, because Jesus kind of clarifies the answer in a broad enough way so that we don't have to know exactly what Peter was referring to. And there's another interesting thing here too, is that, not that this is something that we never see in Luke, but it's an interesting way when Peter says he addresses him as Lord. And then even Luke in verse 42 says, and the Lord said. And the Lord there is the word kurios in Greek, which translates as master. And so Peter and Luke are connecting back to, the story and forward, but back to the story of the master who is going to return. And I think he's, Peter is acknowledging that he's saying that about himself, that he is the master who will return. So he calls Jesus essentially master, referring back to that same idea. So then Jesus' response to Peter's question, he starts with a question himself. Who then is the faithful and sensible steward, whom his master will put in charge of his servants to give them rations at the proper time? So who is the faithful and the sensible steward? Who is going to be faithful? What servants will Jesus have? Does he have that are faithful to him? And there's really, this is kind of the first of two different ideas that Jesus brings up to fully answer Peter's question, right? Because he's asking this question, does it just apply to us or to everyone else? And so he says, right, verse 43, blessed is that slave whom the master finds so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you that he will put you in charge of all of his possessions. And so he's saying, the faithful servant will be blessed, will be put in charge. When he returns, he will find him doing his will and will, in some sense promote him, give him more opportunities to serve, and he will be blessed and will have what he needs. And then he says, verse 45 begins kind of the other side, right? So you have this slave, if he says in his heart, my master will be a long time in coming, and begins to beat the slaves, both men and women, and to eat, to drink, and get drunk. And so you have this other slave that, says, well, he's not going to be coming back for a while. So he begins to, forget the will of his master and to go against that will, to mistreat people and to in some sense eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die, right? Thinking back to Ecclesiastes, that idea of life without God. But the master of that slave will come on a day when he does not expect him, in an hour he does not know. So for anyone, Jesus is going to return at an unknown hour, but the faithful servant is prepared for his coming, but the unfaithful is unprepared. And it says, the master will return and will cut him in pieces and assign him a place with the unbelievers. And that slave who knew his master's will and did not get ready or act in accord with his will receive many lashes. But the one who did not know it and committed deeds worthy of a flogging will receive but few. And so the idea really here is that of judgment. Those who are not faithful followers of Jesus will be judged justly when Jesus returns. And it closes with, for everyone who has been given much, much will be required. And to whom they entrusted much, of him they will ask all the more. And so, we already have this idea of no matter how little we've been given, we already know enough, right? That's why in verse 48 says, the one who did not know and committed deeds worthy of a flogging will receive but few. Even though they didn't know the full truth, they knew enough to know that what they were doing was wrong. And Romans talks about the general revelation that reveals that there is a God. And though we do not, from general revelation, know who that God is, we do know that we are responsible to him, that we are accountable to him, and that we should be seeking him. And to see that and yet to turn away from that God and to not seek him does mean that we are, or we would be, in that case, guilty, and the just punishment would be that it says, if we receive but few lashes, the just punishment is still an eternity away from God in hell. And, but from those who received much, much will be required. And I think what we're thinking about there, like if I ask you, what do you have? You would your first instinct would be to say, well, I have a car, I have a house, or, I have this or that. But material wise, but really what it's referring to is the knowledge that you've been given. We've heard the gospel that Jesus Christ came to this world full of sinners to die so that we could have his righteousness put upon us while he paid the price for our sins. And that's the gospel, that Jesus took our punishment for us. And he entrusted that to us. So, to his disciples and to his followers, even to this day, the lasting really question of Jesus is, are we as followers of Jesus faithfully using what we've been entrusted, the gospel, for his will, for his glory? And are we seeking him in that? Or have we, fallen away from that? Have we said, well, he's a long time in coming, and gotten away from his will? Or have we kept to his will? Are we seeking after him and seeking after his will all the more, knowing that every day, every time we open the Word of God, every time we study the Bible, he gives us more and more. And when he gives us more, it's required more of us. And so are we using that more, that knowledge, that knowledge of God? Are we using that for his will, to advance his kingdom, to promote his kingdom, to help others know Christ? That's what Jesus is calling us to do here, to follow him faithfully and to carry out his will, to bring his kingdom on earth as it is in heaven.